What happens when a man who can buy anything is served a dish of disrespect? Julian Hayes, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech empire, was flying first class on Sovereign Airlines' most prestigious route. He expected perfection, but what he got was a plate of moldy food and a side of condescending smirks from the crew. 9 minutes later, in a storm of fury, he did the unthinkable. He fired the entire airline crew on the spot. But this isn't a simple story of a rich man's rage. It's a tale of hidden motives, viral outrage, and a brutal lesson in karma that would threaten to bring his entire empire crashing down. The air in first class aboard Sovereign Airlines Flight 7, a non-stop from New York to London, was a carefully curated symphony of privilege. It smelled of expensive leather, muted perfume, and the faint, clean scent of recycled air chilled to a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit. For Julian Hayes, founder and CEO of the tech behemoth Nexus Innovations, this was his office, his sanctuary, his gilded cage at 35,000 feet. At 42, he had the kind of wealth that didn't just whisper, it roared. His face, a handsome, angular sculpture of ambition, had graced the cover of Forbes and Time. He was a titan, a visionary, a black man who had shattered every ceiling placed above him and built a skyscraper in its place. Julian was a man of routine, of meticulous, almost obsessive detail. His suit, a bespoke Tom Ford, was wrinkle-free. The documents in his slim leather briefcase were arranged by urgency. Even his pre-ordered meal was a testament to his control. A seared ahi tuna salad with a light vinaigrette. No onions. It was a meal he'd had 100 times on this exact flight. It was predictable. It was safe. Control was the currency of his life. It had bought him everything he owned. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Patricia, approached his pod with a smile that was technically perfect but held no warmth. It was a smile practiced in a mirror, designed for service, not connection. She was in her late 50s, with a helmet of blonde hair that seemed immovable, and eyes the color of a winter sky. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice a smooth, practiced melody. "We'll be serving your meal shortly. May I get you another glass of the Dom Perignon?" "Just sparkling water, thank you, Patricia," Julian replied, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention without needing to be raised. He didn't look up from his tablet, where market data scrolled in endless green and red streams. The casual use of her first name was a subtle power play, a reminder that he had flown this route so often he knew the senior crew. He was not just a passenger, he was a fixture. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, sir." She returned moments later with the water, and then, with a flourish, placed his meal on the polished wood-grain tray. The plate was pristine white porcelain, the tuna seared to a perfect pink in the center, flanked by a colorful medley of greens, avocado, and cherry tomatoes. It looked, as always, immaculate. Julian set his tablet aside. He believed that focus was the key to success in all things, whether it was a multi-billion-dollar acquisition or a simple meal. He picked up his fork, the heavy silver cool against his skin. He speared a piece of avocado and a leaf of arugula, bringing it to his mouth. The taste was fresh, clean. He then moved to the main event, the tuna. He sliced a piece with the side of his fork and lifted it. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a discoloration, a faint, fuzzy patch of greenish-blue on the underside of the perfectly seared fish. He paused, his fork hovering. He blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the low, ambient lighting. He angled the plate, catching the beam from his personal reading light. There was no mistake. It was mold, a small but undeniable bloom of fungus nestled against the delicate pink flesh of the fish. A cold, sharp anger, potent and immediate, shot through him. It wasn't just about the mold. It was about the violation. He paid an exorbitant amount for this seat, for this experience. He paid for perfection, for the seamless, frictionless existence that his wealth was supposed to guarantee. Mold was a failure, a flaw in the system. It was a detail that had been missed, an imperfection in his controlled world, and it had been served to him. He looked around the cabin. The other passengers in their multi-thousand-dollar pods were oblivious, lost in their movies, their champagne, their own bubbles of privilege. He was the only black man in the first-class cabin. He was used to it. He was also used to the subtle, almost invisible extra scrutiny that came with it. The slight pause before his credit card was accepted, the overly solicitous service that felt more like surveillance, the assumptions that he was a musician or an athlete, not the architect of a technological empire. He pressed the call button, the blue light glowing in the dim cabin like a warning beacon. The anger was simmering now, a low, dangerous heat in his chest. This was not just about spoiled food. It was about respect. It was about a standard of service he had more than paid for, a standard that in this moment he felt was being withheld. He thought of the countless microaggressions he'd endured on his way to the top, the quiet dismissals, the patronizing tones. This moldy fish felt like the culmination of all of them, served up on a porcelain plate. Patricia appeared a few seconds later, her practiced smile firmly back in place. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. Is everything all right?" Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply pointed his fork at the offending patch of green. "Patricia," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "What is that?" Her eyes followed his gesture. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance? Disbelief? It was quickly replaced by a look of professional concern, but Julian had seen it. He had seen it, and he would not forget it. "Oh my," she said, her voice dripping with synthetic surprise. "I'm so terribly sorry, sir. It seems there's a blemish on the fish." A blemish. The word was so dismissive, so belittling, it was like a spark on dry tinder. The simmering anger in Julian's chest began to boil. "A blemish," he repeated, his voice still quiet but now laced with steel. "Patricia, that is not a blemish. That is mold. You have served me moldy food in a $10,000 seat. I'd like to know how that happens." The drama had begun. The curtain had risen on a stage at 35,000 feet, and Julian Hayes was about to give the performance of a lifetime. The other passengers were still in their own worlds, but soon, the entire cabin, and then the world, would be watching. The 9 minutes that would change everything had just begun to tick away. Patricia's face hardened, the professional veneer cracking under the intensity of Julian's stare. The synthetic sweetness in her voice curdled into something defensive. "Sir, I assure you, our food is prepared to the highest standards. It's probably just a bit of seasoning that looks unusual under the cabin lighting." She reached for the plate, but Julian placed his hand over it, a gesture that was both a stop sign and a claim of evidence. His fingers were long and elegant, but they rested on the porcelain with an undeniable weight of power. "Don't insult my intelligence, Patricia," he said, the softness in his voice gone, replaced by a cutting edge. "I know what mold is, and I know what condescension is. Get your purser." The word purser hung in the air, a clear escalation. Patricia's jaw clenched. She was the lead flight attendant, the queen of this metal tube, accustomed to de-escalating, to placating, to managing the whims of the wealthy. But Julian wasn't whimsical. He was offended, and his offense was a force of nature. She gave a stiff nod and turned, her movements clipped and angry. A younger flight attendant, Maria, who had been observing from the galley, looked on with wide, nervous eyes. The hush in the first-class cabin was no longer serene. It was tense. A few passengers had lowered their noise-canceling headphones, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. A minute later, Patricia returned with the purser, a man named Clark. He was a tall, thin man with a weary air, as if he'd seen every possible permutation of passenger complaint and was tired of all of them. "Mr. Hayes," Clark began, attempting a tone of authoritative calm, "Patricia tells me there's an issue with your meal." "There isn't an issue, Clark," Julian corrected him, his eyes locked on the man. "There is a failure of safety, of quality, and of service. This airline, your airline, served me food that is unfit for consumption." He lifted his hand from the plate, revealing the fuzzy green patch in all its glory. "Explain this to me." Clark leaned in, squinting. He straightened up, a flicker of genuine surprise on his face. "I see. Sir, on behalf of Sovereign Airlines, I do apologize. This is completely unacceptable. Let me get you a fresh meal immediately. And of course, this entire meal service will be on us." It was the standard response. The script. Acknowledge, apologize, offer a token. But to Julian, it was salt in the wound. "On you?" Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh that was devoid of humor. It was a sharp, bitter sound. "Clark, this ticket cost more than the average person's monthly salary. You think comping a salad is the solution here?" Patricia stepped forward again, her patience clearly gone. "Sir, we have apologized. We've offered to replace it. I'm not sure what more you expect. It's a small piece of fish." And there it was, the dismissal, the minimization, the subtle implication that he was overreacting, that his complaint was disproportionate, perhaps even unreasonable. In that moment, Julian saw not just a flight attendant, but a gatekeeper of a system that had underestimated him his entire life. "What I expect," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "is a standard of service that doesn't include botulism. What I expect is not to be patronized. You're not sorry this happened. You're sorry I noticed." He turned his gaze to Patricia, and it was like being pinned by a laser. "You're sorry I'm the kind of passenger who would call you out on it." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "That is an unfair accusation, sir." "Is it?" Julian shot back. He gestured around the cabin. "Let me ask you a question, Patricia. If Mr. Henderson in 2A or Mrs. Gable in 3F found this on their plate, would you have called it a blemish, or would you have been tripping over yourselves in apology?" He didn't need an answer. The accusation hung in the air, thick and undeniable. He was making it about more than the fish. He was making it about him, about his race, about the quality of service he was receiving versus what he perceived others were receiving. Whether it was true or not, in that moment, it was his truth. Clark tried to intervene. "Mr. Hayes, please, let's not make this personal. It's a simple mistake." "There are no simple mistakes at this level," Julian retorted, his anger now a white-hot flame. "Not in my business and not in yours. Mistakes at this level get people hurt, or in my case, poisoned." He paused, his eyes sweeping from Patricia to Clark, and then to Maria, who was trying to make herself invisible in the galley. He saw not a team, but a conspiracy of mediocrity and disrespect. He made a decision. It was audacious, it was unprecedented, and it was born of pure, unadulterated fury. He reached for his phone, a custom Nexus model that wasn't even on the market yet. He tapped the screen a few times, his movements swift and precise. "Clark," Julian said, his voice now eerily calm, "what is the tail number of this aircraft?" Clark blinked, confused. I don't see how that's relevant." "It's about to become the most relevant fact of your career. Tail number, now." Shaken by the sudden shift in Julian's demeanor, Clark stammered, "It's an 771 SA." Julian's fingers flew across the screen. He was sending an email, a short, powerful sea-level email. The recipient was Robert Strickland, the CEO of Sovereign Airlines. The two men moved in similar circles. They'd shared a golf course and a bottle of scotch on more than one occasion. Julian had his personal email, and he knew Strickland checked it obsessively. The subject line was simple: "Unacceptable, Flight 7. The body of the email was even simpler: "Robert, your crew on an 771 SA just served me moldy food and then insulted my intelligence. I've attached a photo. I sit on the board of the consortium that holds a 12% stake in your airline. As of this moment, consider the entire crew of this flight terminated for cause. Their utter lack of safety standards and customer service is a liability I'm not willing to tolerate. We'll discuss the severance packages on Monday. Julian." He hit send. The whole process, from the moment Patricia had first dismissed him to the sending of the email, had taken less than 9 minutes. He looked up at the crew, A smug, triumphant smile touched his lips. It was a cruel smile, but he felt he had earned the right to it. "Consider this your 2-week notice," he said, the calm in his voice more chilling than any shout. "Effective immediately, all of you." Patricia's mouth fell open. Clark stared, his face ashen. Maria, the young flight attendant, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You can't do that," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "I just did," Julian replied, leaning back in his seat. He picked up his tablet and, with a dismissive air, resumed scrolling through his market data as if nothing had happened. He had dropped a bomb from 35,000 feet, and now he was simply waiting to see the mushroom cloud. The gilded cage had become a courtroom, and he had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. The silence that followed Julian's declaration was more profound than the drone of the engines. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the first-class cabin. Patricia's face, which had been flushed with anger, was now a ghastly, chalky white. Clark stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish on a deck. Only Maria seemed capable of sound, a small, strangled sob escaping her lips. "You're insane," Patricia finally hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You are a passenger. You have no authority here." Julian didn't even look up from his tablet. "I have 12% of the authority, Patricia, and my authority just spoke to your CEO. I'd check your corporate email when we land. Or don't. The result is the same." The finality in his tone was absolute. He had closed the case. But the fallout was just beginning. A man in the adjacent pod, a silver-haired executive type who had been watching the drama unfold over the rim of his champagne flute, leaned over. "I say, is that really necessary? It was just a spot of mold, wasn't it?" Julian turned his head slowly, his eyes cold. "And you are?" "Arthur Penhaligon," the man said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Penhaligon Textiles." "Mr. Penhaligon," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "When your textiles start giving people food poisoning, feel free to manage your quality control as you see fit. This is my business." He gestured vaguely, encompassing not just the airline, but the entire sphere of his influence. Penhaligon recoiled as if struck, slumping back into his seat and quickly raising his glass to his lips. He was used to being the most important man in the room. He had just been reminded, brutally, that he wasn't. The shockwave was spreading. In the galley, Clark was speaking frantically into the cockpit intercom, his voice a low, panicked murmur. Patricia was leaning against a counter, her hands trembling. Maria was openly crying now, her shoulders shaking. She was barely 25. This was her dream job, and it was evaporating in midair because of a piece of fish. Julian felt a flicker of something in his chest. It wasn't regret. Not yet. It was satisfaction. A deep, primal satisfaction at having exercised his power so completely, at having shattered the composure of those who had disrespected him. He had been underestimated, and he had responded with overwhelming force. It was the story of his life, the principle that had guided his ascent. Never let an insult stand, never let a weakness show. But as he glanced at the tear-streaked face of the young flight attendant, a different feeling pricked at the edges of his consciousness. It was a faint, almost imperceptible twinge of something. Collateral damage. He crushed it down. They were a team. They had failed as a team. They would be punished as a team. It was simple. A woman in a seat across the aisle who had been watching the entire exchange with a keen, intelligent expression, now unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. She was in her 30s with sharp features and a no-nonsense air. She walked over to Julian's pod. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm and measured. "My name is Sarah Jensen. I'm a journalist with the New York Times." Julian's eyes narrowed. Of course, the one flight where his temper flared, and there was a reporter from the Times not 10 feet away. "I hope you're enjoying your flight, Miss Jensen," he said non-committally. "It's certainly become more eventful," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "You understand that what just happened is a story, a very big story. A black CEO fires an entire airline crew mid-flight. The optics are complex. The optics are simple, Julian countered, his tone hardening. A customer received dangerously substandard service and took decisive action through the proper corporate channels. By sending an email to the CEO and firing them on the spot? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Some might call that a gross abuse of power. Others might call it justice. My job is to find out which it is. Do you have a comment? Julian stared at her for a long moment. He knew he was on the record. He knew that whatever he said next would be dissected and analyzed by millions of people. The satisfaction he had felt moments before was beginning to be replaced by a cold, strategic calculation. He had won the battle, but the war for the narrative was just about to begin. My comment, he said carefully, is that Nexus Innovations was built on a foundation of zero tolerance for failure. I apply that same standard to every company I invest in. Sovereign Airlines failed that standard today, in a way that put a passenger's health at risk. The individuals responsible have been held accountable. That's the story. It was a good statement, corporate, decisive, and devoid of the raw emotion that had fueled his actions. Sarah Jensen nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. And what about the flight attendant who was crying? Was she also responsible? The question hit its mark. The image of Maria's distraught face flashed in his mind. He had fired a veteran who insulted him, a purser who failed to control his staff, and a young woman whose only crime was being part of the crew. They were a team, Julian said, his voice a little too forceful. In my world, you succeed as a team, and you fail as a team. There is no room for exceptions. He turned away from her, a clear dismissal. He put his headphones on, turning up the volume on a classical playlist, a wall of sound to block out the world. But he couldn't block out the image of the crying girl. He couldn't block out the journalist's probing questions. And he couldn't block out the tiny, insidious thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as simple as he wanted it to be. The remaining 6 hours of the flight were the longest of his life. The atmosphere was thick with resentment and fear. The crew moved like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. Service ground to a halt. No more champagne was offered. No one dared to approach Julian's pod. He had become a pariah in his own kingdom, a king who had executed his court and now sat alone on his throne in a silent, gilded cage, hurtling through the dark towards a storm of his own making. The moment the wheels of Sovereign Air Flight 7 touched down at Heathrow, the story broke. Sarah Jensen must have filed it via the plane's Wi-Fi the second Julian had dismissed her. The New York Times headline was explosive. Billionaire CEO fires entire airline crew mid-flight over moldy fish. By the time Julian cleared the private customs suite, his phone was vibrating incessantly, a frantic, buzzing swarm of notifications. The story was everywhere. It was the lead item on CNN, BBC News, and was trending #1 globally on X. The narrative was splitting into predictable, polarizing camps. To some, he was a hero, a consumer rights champion striking a blow against corporate indifference. Finally, someone holds these airlines accountable. One comment read, "That's how you use FU money," said another. But to many more, he was the villain, a new money-arrogant bully, a petulant tyrant. The racial angle was immediately seized upon, twisted and contorted. On right-wing news sites, he was portrayed as an aggressive black man with a chip on his shoulder, using his power to terrorize a hard-working, white, middle-aged woman. The photo he had sent to the CEO, which had been leaked, was juxtaposed with a stock photo of Patricia looking like a wholesome grandmother. The headline on one particularly vicious blog read, "Black Tech Mogul's Power Trip, a White Crew Fired for a Blemish." The corporate world reacted with a mixture of shock and quiet condemnation. It was seen as unstable, emotional, and unpredictable behavior. The board of Nexus Innovations, his own company, called an emergency virtual meeting. "Julian, what the hell were you thinking?" demanded Marcus Thorne, the oldest and most influential board member. His image on Julian's screen was grainy, but his disapproval was crystal clear. "We've got a PR crisis that's making our stock dip. CEO with a temper is not the brand we've spent a decade building." I was a customer who received a dangerous product, Julian argued, pacing his penthouse suite at the Savoy. And I am a major shareholder who took decisive action to protect my investment. You were a bully, Julian, another board member, Chloe Webb, interjected. You fired a junior flight attendant who probably had nothing to do with it. You've made the company and, by extension, all of us look like monsters. The pressure was immense. His carefully constructed image as a cool, calculating visionary was being replaced by that of a hot-headed despot. He was used to being in control of the narrative. Now he was the narrative, and it was a story he didn't recognize. Meanwhile, Sovereign Airlines was in full panic mode. Their initial response was a mealy-mouthed statement about investigating an in-flight incident. But public pressure was mounting. A union representing flight attendants was calling for a boycott of the airline and a formal investigation into Julian's unprecedented and dangerous abuse of a passenger investor role. Robert Strickland, the CEO of Sovereign, called him. He sounded apoplectic. Julian, you've put me in an impossible position. The union is threatening to strike. The press is crucifying us both. You had no right to fire my staff. I have a 12% right, Robert, Julian said coldly. And your staff had no right to serve me mold. Fix it. He hung up, the bravado a thin shield against the growing unease in his gut. He was right. He knew he was right. But the world seemed determined to prove him wrong. It was Sarah Jensen, the journalist from the flight, who delivered the twist. 2 days after they landed, she published a follow-up piece. It was a deep dive, meticulously researched, and it changed everything. The headline was even more incendiary than the first. The mold was a setup. Fired flight attendant had a history of targeting high-profile passengers. The article was a bombshell. Sarah had dug into Patricia's employment history. It turned out the lead flight attendant was not the victimized grandmother the media had portrayed her as. She had a string of complaints against her, all from wealthy or high-profile minority passengers. A famous Bollywood actor had complained about being accidentally served a beef dish, despite specifying his Hindu faith. A prominent female banker of Asian descent had filed a report about Patricia being consistently rude and dismissive. But the most damning revelation came from a former Sovereign Airlines caterer at JFK. The man, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, claimed he had seen Patricia go into the catering facility just before the flight. He said she'd specifically asked to inspect the first-class meals for Flight 7. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after the story broke, he put 2 and 2 together. The final piece of the puzzle was a brief, almost missed detail. Patricia's husband had recently lost his entire pension when his company's stock collapsed. The company, a smaller tech firm that had been driven out of business a year earlier in a particularly aggressive but entirely legal market takeover. The takeover was engineered by Nexus Innovations, by Julian Hayes. The moldy fish wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a failure of quality control. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. It was personal. Patricia hadn't just been dismissive. She had been vengeful. She had targeted him. She had baited a trap, knowing his reputation for high standards and a low tolerance for failure. She had wanted a confrontation. She had wanted to provoke him. The world had seen a rich man's tantrum, but it was, in fact, an orchestrated attack. The revelation sent a new shockwave through the media. The narrative flipped on its head. Julian was no longer the villain. He was the victim of a malicious, premeditated plot. Support surged for him. The same outlets that had condemned him were now running stories about the vengeful flight attendant. Sovereign Airlines immediately fired Patricia, this time for real, and issued a groveling public apology to Julian. He should have felt vindicated. He should have felt triumphant. He had been right all along, more right than he could have ever imagined. He had won. But as he stood in his silent hotel suite looking out over the gray London skyline, he felt a profound and unsettling coldness spread through him. He hadn't known any of this when he had fired them. He had fired Clark, the weary purser. He had fired Maria, the young, crying flight attendant. He had ruined their careers, their lives, based on his own raw, unchecked fury. His decision had been based on arrogance and anger, not on the facts. The fact that he had been, by sheer dumb luck, correct in his assessment of Patricia's malice didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a terrifying coincidence. It meant that his rage, his abuse of power, had been accidentally justified. It didn't absolve him. In a strange, sickening way, it made it worse. The hard karma he had so casually dispensed was now circling back, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't coming from the outside world, which was now cheering him on. It was coming from within. It was the chilling realization that he had acted like a tyrant, and the universe had, by some cruel twist of fate, rearranged itself to prove him right. And that was a more terrifying thought than any bad press. The public exoneration was swift and absolute. Julian Hayes was no longer the villain of the story. He was the savvy, albeit ruthless protagonist who had sniffed out a corporate saboteur. Hash's stand with Hayes started trending. Sovereign Airlines, desperate to staunch the bleeding, offered him a lifetime of free first-class travel anywhere in the world, an offer he publicly and icily declined. His board, which had been on the verge of revolt, was now praising his decisive instincts. He was on top of the world again. But it was a hollow, desolate peak. The twist had saved his reputation, but it had shattered his self-perception. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, not with satisfaction, but with a growing sense of horror. He hadn't been a master strategist uncovering a plot. He had been an angry man who had lashed out with disproportionate force, and the shrapnel had hit everyone in the vicinity. The first ricochet of karma came in the form of an email. It wasn't from a lawyer or a reporter. It was from Maria, the young flight attendant. Her name in his inbox made his stomach clench. He had expected a lawsuit, a demand, a threat, but the email was something far worse. It was polite. Subject: regarding Flight 7. Dear Mr. Hayes, I am writing to you because I don't know what else to do. My name is Maria Sanchez. I was the junior flight attendant on your flight from New York to London last week. First, I want to apologize for what happened. The service you received was unacceptable, and I am ashamed to have been part of a crew that allowed it to happen. I saw the mold on the fish when Patricia was taking it to you. I should have said something, but I was new and she was the lead. I was scared of her. That is not an excuse, but it is the truth. My silence makes me complicit, and for that I am truly sorry. Because of my termination, I have lost my job and my flight certification is under review. My dream, since I was a little girl growing up in Queens, was to fly. I worked 2 jobs through college to pay for my training. This was my first transatlantic route. I know you are a powerful man, and I know you were wronged by Patricia. I read the news, but Mr. Hayes, I am not Patricia, and neither was Clark. He was just a man trying to do his job, trying to de-escalate a situation he didn't understand. He has a family, a mortgage, a son in college. He's a good man. I don't expect you to give me my job back, but I am asking you from one human being to another to please consider making a statement that clarifies that the fault was not with the entire crew. Your words carry so much weight. Your single word, team, has ended our careers. Perhaps another word from you could give us a chance to start again. Thank you for your time. Sincerely, Maria Sanchez. Julian read the email 3 times. Each word was a small, sharp cut. I was scared of her. My silence makes me complicit. I am not Patricia. He remembered her face, streaked with tears. He had seen her not as a person, but as an extension of the woman who had insulted him. He had lumped her, and the weary purser, Clark, into a single entity of failure, and punished them all as one. His philosophy of succeed as a team, fail as a team, which sounded so strong and decisive in a boardroom, suddenly seemed like a blunt, clumsy instrument of cruelty. He tried to dismiss it. He tried to tell himself it was just emotional blackmail, but Maria's quiet dignity and her desperate, reasonable plea cut through his defenses. He had wielded his power like a cudgel, and he had shattered the lives of people who were, at worst, guilty of cowardice in the face of a difficult superior. The second ricochet was more public. Clark, the purser, gave an interview to a small, independent aviation blog. He didn't attack Julian. He didn't make excuses. He just told his story. He spoke of his 28 years with the airline, his pride in his work, the stress of the job. He admitted he should have handled the situation with Mr. Hayes better. He admitted he was intimidated. Then he said something that stopped Julian cold. "The thing is," Clark said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "I've seen passengers like Mr. Hayes before. Powerful men who are so used to being disrespected, they see it everywhere, even when it's not there. They're like coiled springs. You make one wrong move and they just explode. I don't think he's a bad man. I think he's a man who has been in a fight his whole life, and he doesn't know how to stop fighting." He doesn't know how to stop fighting. The line echoed in the vast, empty space of Julian's penthouse. Was that what he had become? A fighter so conditioned for battle that he saw every interaction as a potential skirmish, every slight as an act of war. He had fought his way out of poverty, fought his way through racist institutions, fought his way to the top of the corporate ladder. The fight was all he knew. But Clark's words suggested that the fight was now consuming him, blinding him to the nuances of the world, to the humanity of the people around him. The final, hardest blow of karma was internal. It came late one night as he stared at his own reflection in the dark glass of his window, the lights of London a glittering, indifferent backdrop. He had won. The world said so. He had been wronged and had emerged victorious. But he felt a profound, corrosive sense of shame. His rage hadn't been righteous. It had been egotistical. He hadn't been defending a principle. He had been defending his pride. The fact that his pride had been deliberately targeted by Patricia was irrelevant. His reaction was his own. He, Julian Hayes, the man of control, the master of strategy, had been played. Patricia had pushed a button, and he had reacted exactly as she had predicted. He had let his anger make him her puppet. He had fired an entire crew not because they were a threat to his investment, but because they had made him feel small, disrespected, and powerless for a fleeting moment. And to reclaim his power, he had unleashed a devastating, life-altering punishment on them all. The discovery of Patricia's plot didn't make him a hero. It just made him a pawn who had been lucky enough to have his tantrum retroactively justified. The karma wasn't a public downfall. It wasn't a financial loss. It was the sickening, inescapable knowledge of his own fallibility. It was the mirror image of Clark's words staring back at him. A man who didn't know how to stop fighting. A man who had built an empire to protect himself, only to become a prisoner inside it. He picked up his phone. His fingers hovered over his contacts. He could call his PR team and issue a statement. He could have his lawyers wire Maria and Clark a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. He could smooth it all over, manage the narrative, and move on. That was the old Julian's way. Instead, he scrolled down to a different name. Sarah Jensen, the journalist from the Times, the one who had started it all, and the one who had inadvertently revealed the truth. He pressed the call button. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about taking responsibility. It was about learning how to lay down his arms even for a moment. "Miss Jensen," he said when she answered, his voice quiet but clear. "It's Julian Hayes. I was wrong, and I'd like to go on the record and tell you why." Julian's interview with Sarah Jensen was not conducted in a sterile office or a luxurious hotel suite. At his insistence, they met in a small, unassuming coffee shop in a quiet London neighborhood, far from the prying eyes of the financial district. For the first time in years, Julian Hayes wanted to be just a man, not a brand. The article that resulted was published under the headline, "I Was Wrong. Julian Hayes on Power, Rage, and the Flight That Changed Everything." It was a stunning piece of self-recrimination. Julian took full, unvarnished responsibility for his actions on Flight 7. He didn't hide behind Patricia's treachery. Instead, he owned his reaction to it. "The discovery of Patricia's motive doesn't absolve me," he was quoted as saying. "In fact, it makes my own actions look worse. I didn't act on evidence. I acted on pure, unchecked rage. I was provoked, yes, But a man in my position, with my power, cannot afford the luxury of being provoked. I wielded my influence like a weapon, not a tool. I hurt innocent people. There is no excuse for that. He talked about Maria Sanchez and Clark, using their full names, praising their service records, and publicly stating that they were collateral damage of his own making. He spoke of Clark's assessment of him, a man who doesn't know how to stop fighting, and admitted its devastating accuracy. I've spent my life building walls to protect myself, he told Jensen. I see now that those same walls became my prison. The fight that got me to the top is the same fight that was beginning to rot me from the inside. The interview was a confession and an apology. At the end, he announced the concrete steps he was taking. He had reached out to Sovereign Airlines CEO and, using his leverage as an investor, demanded the immediate reinstatement of Clark and Maria Sanchez, with full back pay and a formal apology from the airline. For any other crew members on that flight who had been unable to secure new employment, he was personally setting up a fund to cover their lost wages for the next 2 years. For Patricia, he had a different message. I hope she gets the help she needs, he said. What she did was born of pain, and I won't add to that. I will not be pressing charges. The public reaction was a tidal wave. For a world accustomed to billionaires who never admitted fault, his confession was a seismic event. The cynicism was there, of course. Some called it a calculated PR move, a way to rebrand himself as a benevolent leader. But the sincerity, the raw honesty of his words resonated with most. His approval ratings, which had soared after the first twist, now solidified into a new kind of respect. One based not on fear or power, but on a demonstrated capacity for self-reflection and humility. The true cost of his absolution, however, was not paid in public opinion or in money. It was paid in private. A week after the article was published, he flew back to New York. He didn't fly on a private jet. He booked a seat on a commercial flight. In business class, not first. It was a small, symbolic gesture, but it was important to him. Upon his return, he reached out to Maria and Clark personally. He met Maria for coffee in Queens, not far from where she grew up. She was nervous at first, but his quiet, sincere apology put her at ease. She had been reinstated and was back on the reserve list, waiting for her next flight. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did, Maria," he said. "I'm the one who is sorry." His meeting with Clark was at a diner near JFK. The veteran purser looked older and more tired than Julian remembered. They sat in a booth, the smell of stale coffee and bacon in the air. Clark listened as Julian apologized. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching Julian's face. When Julian was finished, Clark was silent for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "in 28 years, I've been yelled at. I've had drinks thrown at me. I've been threatened. But no one has ever come back and apologized, not like this." He shook his head. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Hayes. We are a team. And on that day, our team failed you. Patricia was our leader, and we followed her into failure. Your reaction was a hurricane, but maybe it was the hurricane we needed to wake us up." He extended his hand across the table. "Apology accepted, sir." Julian shook it, feeling a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying begin to lift. The most difficult change was internal. Julian started therapy. He began dismantling the walls he had spent a lifetime building. He started delegating more at Nexus, trusting his team, learning that control was not the only metric of success. He started listening more than he talked. He began to learn how to stop fighting. His empire didn't crumble. In fact, his new leadership style, tempered with a humility that had been unthinkable just months before, made his company stronger, more innovative, and a better place to work. He never forgot the moldy fish. It became a strange, potent symbol for him. A reminder that the smallest flaw, the tiniest patch of rot, could be a symptom of a much deeper decay. And that true power wasn't the ability to punish, to fire, to destroy. It was the ability to see the flaw within yourself, to clean it out, and to rebuild on a stronger, more honest foundation. The 9 minutes of fury on Flight 7 had nearly cost him everything, but in the end, the hard karma that had come for him had delivered not a punishment, but a painful, necessary, and ultimately priceless salvation. 2 years passed. In the hyperspeed world of tech and media, the saga of Flight 7 became a footnote, a case study in corporate ethics classes, a half-remembered viral moment. But for the people at its center, the event was not a footnote. It was a fault line, a deep crack in their lives from which everything new had grown. Julian Hayes sat in the glass-walled boardroom on the 80th floor of the Nexus Tower. The view of Manhattan was breathtaking, a panorama of power he had once coveted. Now, he mostly saw it as a collection of stories, a billion windows with a billion different lives behind them. Before him, a young, ferociously ambitious vice president named Caden was finishing a presentation. It was a proposal for a hostile takeover of a struggling rival, a shark move designed to eliminate a competitor and absorb their assets. It was brilliant, ruthless, and surgically precise. It was exactly the kind of plan the old Julian would have greenlit with a predatory smile. Caden finished, his eyes gleaming, expecting praise. The room was silent. Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished table. "What's the human cost, Caden?" he asked, his voice quiet. Caden blinked. "The cost? Sir, the synergy models project a 30% increase in market share." "That's not what I asked," Julian interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "I asked about the human cost. How many employees at that company will be made redundant? What happens to their pensions? What happens to the town in Ohio where their main factory is the primary employer? Did you model that?" Caden was speechless. The other board members, a mix of old hands who remembered the hurricane and new ones who only knew this calmer, more deliberate Julian, watched intently. "Your plan is strategically sound but ethically hollow," Julian continued. "It's the thinking of a company that wants to conquer, not to build. Go back to the drawing board. Find a way to partner with them. Find a way to invest in their technology, to lift them up, not tear them down. Find a way to win without making 1,000 other people lose. That's the Nexus way now." He dismissed the meeting. As the board members filed out, Marcus Thorne, the veteran who had once reprimanded him, paused by his chair. "That was well handled, Julian. A few years ago, you'd have been sharpening the knives with him." Julian offered a small smile. "A few years ago, I thought the only way to build a skyscraper was to demolish everything around it. I'm learning there's a better way to get a view." Thousands of miles away, Maria Sanchez was conducting her pre-flight briefing. The gold stripes on her uniform glinted under the airport lighting. She was the lead flight attendant now, on the same New York to London route. Her dream, once almost extinguished, was her reality. She was known for her preternatural calm, her ability to diffuse tension with a quiet word and a genuine smile. On her last flight, a self-important politician had been berating a junior crew member over a trivial issue. Maria had stepped in, not with a manager's authority, but with disarming empathy. She had listened to the politician's tirade patiently, validated his frustration, and then smoothly and expertly resolved the issue, leaving him feeling heard and the young crew member feeling protected. Clark, who now sent her postcards from his peaceful retirement in Florida, had taught her the mechanics of the job. Julian Hayes, in his own explosive way, had taught her its true meaning, that everyone, no matter their status, carries their own unseen burdens, and that a little grace can go a long way at 35,000 feet. And what of Patricia? Her story had no triumphant third act. There was no public redemption. After the scandal, her life had unraveled. The media attention, the shame, and the loss of her identity had sent her spiraling. Her husband, already broken by his financial losses, left her. She lost her home. She ended up in a church basement in a forgotten corner of New Jersey, sitting on a metal folding chair in a circle of strangers. It was an anger management support group. For months, she had seethed in bitter silence, blaming Julian Hayes, blaming Sovereign Airlines, blaming the world for her downfall. Her story was a toxic litany of victimhood. But tonight, listening to a young man talk about how his rage had cost him his family, something finally broke. The reflection was too clear, too painful. When it was her turn to speak, the venom was gone. Her voice was small, cracked. "My name is Patricia," she whispered, twisting a loose thread on her worn-out coat. "And I ruined my own life. I had a good life, a good job, but I was so angry. I was angry about money, about getting old, about feeling invisible. I found someone to blame for it all. I wanted to hurt him. I put mold on a plate of food, and I set my whole world on fire." Tears streamed down her face, the first tears of accountability she had ever shed. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a beginning. It was the first agonizing step out of the darkness of her own making. She would never know that the community center where she was finally finding a sliver of peace received a substantial anonymous donation every year from a tech foundation. A foundation established by Julian Hayes, dedicated to second chances and the quiet work of rebuilding. It was his final silent echo of the event, an act of amends for a woman he would never see again, a closing of a circle she never knew was open. Karma, he had learned, was not a lightning strike of cosmic revenge. It was a slow, patient, and often invisible force, working not to punish, but to balance. So, where does this story leave us? It began with a dish of moldy food and an eruption of rage, a seemingly simple story of a powerful man's anger. But it spiraled into a complex human drama about pride, prejudice, and the immense weight of our actions. The easy answer is that Julian Hayes was a villain who became a hero, and Patricia was a villain who got what she deserved. But the truth, as it so often is, lies in the gray spaces in between. This is a story that proves karma isn't always a sudden, dramatic crash. Sometimes it's a slow, unfolding echo. It was in Julian's painful journey from a vengeful tyrant to a self-aware leader. It was in Maria's quiet triumph and Clark's peaceful retirement. And it was in Patricia's lonely, agonizing first step toward accountability in a church basement. Julian's hard karma wasn't the public backlash. It was the chilling realization that he had acted like a monster and been accidentally proven right. His redemption wasn't found in a press release, but in the quiet, daily work of becoming a better man. What do you believe? Can a single act of genuine remorse and accountability truly balance the scales? Can people really change, or do they just get better at managing the person they've always been? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you something to think about, please hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates a story with no easy answers, and make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into the dramas that shape our world.